DNA of 500-year-old bacteria is first direct evidence of an epidemic, one of humanity's deadliest, that occurred after Spanish conquest. One of the worst epidemics in human history, a 16th-century pestilence that devastated Mexico's native population, may have been caused by a deadly form of salmonella from Europe, a pair of studies suggest. In one study, researchers say they have recovered DNA of the stomach bacterium from burials in Mexico linked to a 1540s epidemic that killed up to 80% of the country's native inhabitants. This is potentially the first genetic evidence of the pathogen that caused the massive decline in native populations after European colonization, says Hannes Schroeder, an ancient DNA researcher at the Natural History Museum of Denmark in Copenhagen who was not involved in the work. It's a super cool study.
Having had salmonella, I can honestly say I could see how this could have killed a shit ton of folks. I lost 13 pounds in 1 day. Couldn't even hold water in. 104-degree fever, uncontrollable chills, runs, and a pain in my guts like someone shoved a paint stirrer drill attachment into my intestines. And I had all the best medicine could offer. I cannot imagine what would have happened with nothing to help. This is the first time I've seen salmonella linked to the 1545 outbreak that wiped out a huge portion of the population in the basin of Mexico. It's interesting how healthy people can carry the disease, but pass it on to others through poor sanitation. I'm curious how this might change the discussion of early colonial history in Mexico. Yeah, it's certainly an interesting proposal. The paper is a bit light on practical details. I'd like to eventually see more discussion of the phylogeny, for example, but it's worth noting that the authors are some of the foremost researchers in this area. Definitely a narrative worth monitoring and considering as new papers are published. Modern American colonial history is already heavily distorted in the public's mind. Most people simply assume that colonials killed all the natives, but that's absurd. A few hundred colonials, even if they had muskets, couldn't kill millions of natives. They died largely from disease unintentionally brought over from Europe. Why everybody keeps insisting that Europeans killed all the natives, I'll never know. Disease and suppression of resources were the main reasons. Hard to survive when your people are starving, malnourished, then hit with disease. Yeah, the lack of resources hurts the natives too. But even that wasn't totally the Europeans' fault. The Mayan Empire is thought to have fallen largely because of their unsustainable agricultural practices. So even the lack of resources wasn't wholly caused by the colonialists. IDK about that theory, but it's not very hard to imagine how an isolated civilization could collapse very rapidly. I mean, imagine if New Orleans in 2003 was a super advanced culture, but all around them there were only small pastoral tribes or slash-and-burn horticulturist clans, no equivalent societies within years of travel. Then the massive hurricane hits, destroys much of their built-up infrastructure and kills a significant portion of the population during the storm. It wouldn't matter if they had the most sustainable agriculture possible, if no one from elsewhere is coming to help. That single storm would have annihilated their culture, and the survivors would eventually percolate back out into the surrounding clans and tribes to live like their ancestors. The Mayan civilization was in a small enough area and isolated from any other major civilization that it could easily have been collapsed with a single cataclysm. Similar to the cliff dwellings in southwest Colorado, the people living there spent centuries building up their fortresses, but only 10 years into a 40-year drought the survivors had all packed up and moved on, leaving the cliff houses to only be occupied on occasion by much smaller groups.
There was never such a thing as a Mayan empire. The Mayan civilization went through several cycles of collapse and recovery, and Mayan culture is very much alive to this day. My apologies. The Mayan civilization. And while yes, it is still around today, it had a huge drop-off in the 1300s. Way before the Europeans came. Great civilizations came and went in the Americas. Not everything that happened in the New World revolved around Europeans. Inadvertently still killed them, but I get what you're saying. Well, if we're going to go down that road, then Europeans should start blaming Asians for helping to spread the Black Death to Europe. No population should be blamed for spreading disease before germ theory even existed. It's not blame, it's cause. These are different things. Blame implies fault, cause just leads to effect. Europeans on boats are the cause of the disease arriving in the Americas, though if you insist on looking at it in terms of blame, it's worth noting that the Europeans arrived with the intent of conquering the land and taking anything valuable. It is not. Especially when you consider the first point of contact were the Aztecs, a civilization literally demonized by its neighbors for being hell-bent on conquering the land and taking anything valuable. Surely you aren't so naive as to believe the third-grade fairy tale that a handful of Spaniards armed with a few guns, some metal armor, and the common cold laid waste to tens of millions of people? They received massive amounts of aid from competing tribes who were sick and tired of the Aztecs pillaging their villages and using their people as human sacrifices. You can demonize the Europeans all you want with idealized language and implications, but the Aztecs were literal demon-worshipping, warmongering, monstrous cannibals whose religion firmly believed that they had to cut up children to make the sun rise. That kind of civilization cannot coexist with any other and would have been wiped out by someone one way or another. While I think when people refer to the Europeans destroying the Native American societies, it refers not to conflicts with the initial colonists but more so to the sustained campaign of eradication that developed, missions, boarding schools, Indian Removal Act and the Trail of Tears, etc. That is a dark stain on our cultural history that cannot be explained by they all died of disease. Like, all at once. But it is indeed a convenient, sanitized narrative some people prefer. One of the points that always got me was that Cortez and his men, with thousands of Indian allies, were rejected after their first attack. They had to retreat to the arms of their native allies and recuperate. Truly a native-on-native fight with Spanish awe and European disease. I've also heard there was evidence for their own native disease epidemic just before the Europeans came, so it ended up with like 300 years of non-stop epidemics for the natives. There were epidemics before 1492, sure, the Americas were not disease-free. But these pre-Columbian epidemics were not on the same level of severity as the epidemics that occurred after Europeans arrived. Well, at least we got syphilis out of the deal. I've always figured that people don't want to be labeled as apologists who are defending the early colonials, so they just leave it alone. Yeah, public opinion is weird. First it was godless native savages, then the noble savage, that the white man stole land from and murdered. The reality is it is far more complex than that, but nobody had time for nuance these days. It's not like the Native Americans were treated fairly in any respect though. While that is true, we also need to remember that our concept of fair treatment didn't exist back then. Some Mesoamericans sacrificed members of other tribes, and the early Spanish believed that if these people didn't accept Christianity then they were better off dead. Within the context, neither of these acts should be considered straightforward evil given the beliefs of the time. Wasn't there a large die-off before the Europeans showed up? I thought I remember reading somewhere that the native population was pretty dramatically reduced from its peak when the Europeans showed up. There were numerous peaks and troughs before Europeans. Natives had their own issues to deal with, such as war, drought, feminine famine, disease, etc.
I'm a bit confused. Was this not a well-known fact? I'm from Mexico, and ever since I started taking history classes in elementary/junior high/high school, we were taught that after repealing Cortez advances on to the Aztec city, I can't remember the name, he set up a rather good siege. However, that was not what beat the Aztecs, but an outbreak of salmonella that lowered their numbers considerably. That's what I was always taught, and I left those grades, maybe 20 years ago. Had someone told me this last year, I would have laughed. But I caught salmonella last year, and my God, thank God for indoor plumbing. I can see it bringing down an empire. From 25 million to 1 million. That's unbelievable. Imagine how the world would be if it was reversed and natives were the ones carrying/immune to smallpox, etc. Interestingly, although there is some debate on this, many researchers suspect that syphilis was brought back to Europe from the Americas by Columbus and his men. It was certainly present in the Americas pre-European contact. It didn't devastate the European population as much as European diseases devastated the Americas, but it did some pretty significant damage and killed a bunch of people. Historical reports of it were horrible, and at the time of initial contact it was much more devastating. It caused huge lesions and whole parts of your body to rot and fall off, including pieces of the face and genitals. In the final stages you'd simply go mad. The Dollop podcast does an interesting episode on this, if you're into their kind of history/comedy pairing. It would still suck in the modern day, but, yeesh. Makes you thankful for the time we live in. There might have been a strain of syphilis that Columbus brought back to the Americas, but there's evidence syphilis was in Europe before Columbus too. Deformities consistent with syphilis have been discovered in the teeth of skulls from ancient Greece. They should not have gone to that Chipotle place. Interestingly, there was more than one case of epidemics among the Americas' indigenous population caused by the Europeans throughout the history. However, I have not heard about the opposite, save for syphilis. I guess whatever diseases Europeans contracted from the natives never made it to Europe because people would either die in the Americas or on their way back. The Atlantic Ocean served as a quarantine. Of course, with STD like syphilis it was different, since people could have it for years before dying. So the shits and endless vomiting did them in? Kinda gives a sad, cruel irony to Montezuma's revenge, doesn't it? It is rather interesting though, considering all we have done for decades was just blame smallpox for wiping out the Western Hemisphere. It's important to note that Europeans carried other, almost equally dangerous diseases as well. It's fascinating to see how many of the religious ceremonies in the book of Leviticus were plain sanitation and nearly modern in their efficacy. The recipe for holy water, which uses certain animal sacrifices, results in soapy water, for example. This was all before germ theory, mind. And the don't eat pork bit of the Quran was likely hygienic as well, since undercooked pork can make you very, very ill, particularly without modern medicine. Kosher and halal dietary laws are good sanitary guidelines for wilderness living. Foot washing is healthcare where or when sandals are worn. If God were actually trying to help people on earth, this is actually a reasonable way for him to go about it. Foodborne illness has claimed countless lives over millennia. Many famous people too. Alexander the Great, Henry V. The list goes on. People have no idea how far we have come with food safety.